everybody. I don't know if you can hear me. This is Christy. If you want to let me know in the chat box that you can hear me okay, that'd be super while we're getting set up here. Good to see some familiar names in the attendees list. How y'all? Can you hear me? Yes. Okay, perfect. Thanks, Kristen. Hi. So thank you for joining us today. I'm going to go ahead and start getting everything set up. We'll probably get started here in a few minutes. If you want, you're welcome to go ahead and throw your name and your agency. If you want to say your name, your pronouns, and your agency. If you want to say your title, what you do there too, you can in the chat box. And I realized during my last webinar, I do have permission to allow you to talk, to unmute you and get it to where you can speak. So if you think you want to participate in some of the dialogue, definitely make sure you have your audio set up so you can jump in and speak if you want to. Hi, everybody. Hi, Donna and Amber. Hi, Kristen. Good to see y'all. For those of you who are just joining, we're going to get started here in a couple of minutes. If you want to put your name and pronouns, your agency, and once you do that in the chat box, introduce yourself again. Exciting to see y'all joining us today. We're going to go ahead and start going through our intro slides. Thank you to those of you that are engaging in the chat box. If you've ever been to one of my trainings in the past, whether it was in person or a webinar, you know that I really love interactive training. So I hope that y'all will keep up some enthusiasm for the chat box, and you can definitely raise your hand if you want to ask a question. Let me make sure that we can raise your hand on this call. I'm pretty sure that we can. Last time I had to get someone to show me how to raise your hand. I don't think I can raise the hand because I'm the panelist, but I think it'd be good to the list of the attendees that you can raise your hand. And if not, you can throw a question in the chat box. I'm going to try to keep up with it as we go along. Good to see y'all. It's kind of neat to see so many people from OCRCC, especially those of you who I don't know and maybe haven't met at OCRCC. That's actually, I started there in my practice as a volunteer in 2009. So for those of you not familiar, the North Carolina Coalition Against Sexual Assault is an inclusive statewide alliance working to end sexual violence through education, advocacy, and legislation. We use a social justice framework, and that means that our work is done from a strong intersectional social justice perspective. By centering our work around marginalized communities, everyone gets served. So a lot of times when you hear us talk about social justice work or serving marginalized communities to include our work towards racial equity and being inclusive of LGBTQ communities, part of that's because we know that as long as we're leaving anyone out of the sexual violence solutions and dialogues that we're fostering, that we are failing to address the whole of the problem. What we do for our work, we organize and sponsor statewide trainings around sexual violence. We do support for rape crisis programs. We do resource sharing and technical assistance, which if you've never heard the word technical assistance, all that means is that we're sort of like a hotline for the hotline. So we do like a blend of customer support and life coaching, where you can call us or email when you have challenges, and we can kind of help talk you through what your options are. We do legislative agendas and policy change, anti-human trafficking work, prevention education, which is what I do at NCCASA for the most part, and then we do work on colleges and universities. In this webinar, we're not going to use our language in the same way that we do in a lot of our other webinars, but we do like to always give people a reminder that whenever we use she and he, that research shows us that 90% of sexual assault victims are women and the majority of perpetrators are men, even with violence against men. And we also are aware that the way we construct our frameworks determine what we find when we put out surveys and calls for information or look at reporting information. We do frequently use non-gendered pronouns, both so that people will see themselves reflected in the language. Audio is funky. Oh gosh, summer. Is that, let me just take my microphone. Is that any better? Okay, so I will just hold my earbud in front of my mouth. We're cool. But we do use non-gendered pronouns a lot. Part of that's because victims and harm doers can be of a non-binary gender, but part of it's because when we use non-gendered language, anyone who is a survivor can see themselves reflected in the language that we're using. We do acknowledge that not all women are victims, not all men are perpetrators. Any gender can be a victim and any gender can be a perpetrator. So this webinar is going to be on serving LGBTQ survivors. We did an LGBTQ 101 maybe a week or two ago that went pretty well. We have a recording of it in Coalition Manager. So any of you who are with NCCASA member agencies should have been able to set up your own login with your work email to Coalition Manager for NCCASA, and you can go into Coalition Manager and access the resource section and see the 101 if you want. If you don't have a login to Coalition Manager, you can email an NCCASA staff person named Madison, and Madison's email is SASP, S-A-S-P, @nccasa.org. And again, that's for NCCASA member agency members. You can access that recording and recordings of several other webinars and some handbooks and toolkits we've put together for you. This webinar series came about actually from a request from Child Advocacy Centers of North Carolina. They had been having weekly victim advocate meetings and had asked their victim advocates, while we're during the pandemic and doing so much remote work, what topics would you like us to offer professional development on? And this was a topic that they had requested information on, and I felt like it made the most sense to break it out into 2 webinars, because a lot of times we learn the 101, which is where we learn what the letters stand for, what it means, how to understand gender and identity, and then we think we've just fixed it, as if learning the right words to use somehow means that we can serve LGBTQ survivors in practice. So we wanted to have a follow-up webinar that's going to get a little more into what that will look like in practice to create inclusive agencies. This webinar is by no means comprehensive. It's an ongoing process, and agencies spend months and years working towards becoming more inclusive, but this will at least get you started on the right track with that. Yes, and I've already mentioned that the 101 recording is available in Coalition Manager. About me, my name is Christy. My pronouns are they, them. Currently at NCCASA, I'm the Prevention Education Program Manager. Before that, I was the Anti-Human Trafficking Specialist, and before that, I did a decade at Orange County Rape Crisis Center. I started out in 2009 as a hotline volunteer doing hospital and court and legal and law enforcement accompaniment and answering hotlines. And I also led support groups there, and then did that off and on for a while, and then came on as staff a few years ago and came to NCCASA. Over the years, I've done some other work in crisis response. I actually got my crisis response start in 1994 on a suicide and self-harm hotline. So I've been doing this a minute, and I still love my work. I want to bring up my identities, just because that's important for all of us when we're talking about issues and explaining them to others and framing issues, to remember that we are seeing the issue through our own personal lens. So I am a white, non-binary or genderqueer. Other identities that play into it for me are bisexual, pansexual, queer. I'm college educated. I have a graduate degree. I have a job that I love. I also grew up in poverty and have lived experience of a variety of forms of violence and trauma. I've lived experience of homelessness. So I have a lot of intersecting identities, and some of those put me in a position of having more power in our culture. Some of them put me in a position of having less power in our culture, but I'm always aware of remembering in those places where my identity gives me a little more power, to be aware of listening to the voices of people who have different identities. And so I want to bring up a few more people you may want to follow online or learn more about, maybe watch videos they've done, learn from them. These are all people who have influenced the way that I understand LGBTQ issues. We have Aisha Simmons, Anita Slahin, Ignacio Rivera. The Trans Latina Coalition is doing really wonderful work. In Our Own Voices is a nonprofit out of Albany, New York, that is by and focused on the needs of LGBT people of color, and it does sexual violence, domestic violence, just reducing all forms of violence and providing support for survivors. Black Trans Media is wonderful, and QTPOC Mental Health on the social media does a whole lot to highlight some of the issues that people like me might not think about as much. So if you want to follow people with a diversity of perspectives, these are some good people to start with. I'm going to pause periodically to clear my throat. Give me 1 second. Because a global pandemic around a respiratory illness is a great time to have spring and allergies happen at the same time. So just some disclaimers and agreements. I'm going to talk about what we know now to be current best practices for inclusive language and framework, and yet not all LGBTQ people are the same or have the same preferences. So I'm going to tell you what I've discerned from my reading and learning is the best way to go about things. And also you may occasionally encounter other people who are like, oh, I hate that word, or that's not at all how I experience it. So just remember, we are not monoliths. Remember that language is always fluid, evolving, and contested, even within communities. Some of the most spectacular arguments around language and frameworks and how to understand gender identity are happening within the LGBTQ community. So me telling you what are best practices today, these are not the same words we used 25 years ago when I first became part of this dialogue, and these are not the same words they're going to use a decade from now. So it's always going to be moving. A lot of times you'll hear me say victim or survivor. Typically, I tend to reserve saying victim when I'm speaking about a legal framework or a crime. When I say survivor, I'm talking about harm that was done. So not all things that cause harm are criminal, and not all things that are criminal are universally agreed to cause harm. It just kind of depends on the framework you want to use, but that's how I tend to understand it. Victim is a criminal or legal framework. Survivor is when we're talking about harm and its impact on you and how you've moved through it. Same with perpetrator versus harm doer. There are plenty of levels of harm that can be done against other people that may or may not rise to the level of being criminal. So when I say perpetrator, I'm typically talking about a crime or a legal framework. When I say harm doer, I'm talking about someone who causes harm to another. Again, I mentioned earlier, this is an overview, not an in-depth course. And I also want to warn you that we're going to be talking about sexual violence, domestic violence, human trafficking, and other forms of violence against LGBTQ people. So for any of you who, because you're human, have tender hearts, I want to just give you permission right now to do what you need to do to take care of yourself. If something starts to feel overwhelming, take a few deep breaths, step away from the computer for a moment, take the earbuds out. This is tricky stuff, and especially for those of you who do identify as LGBTQ, I want to just give you a nice reminder to take care of yourself through the webinar and after. I love really engaging interactive webinars, so hit me up with questions and comments and thoughts in the chat box. And I want all of us to assume good intentions, so there's not really any silly questions. A lot of times in these dialogues, we talk about how you don't need to be asking LGBTQ people all kinds of weird questions about their life because that can feel intrusive, to feel like you have to be someone's educator everywhere you go. But that's the whole point of this webinar. So this is a place where you can ask those questions that you might have and be too nervous or thoughtful to ask in other spaces. You can ask them here today, and we're going to assume good intentions. So just building a little empathy, and again, those of you who are LGBTQ can opt out of this exercise, but you don't need to respond. I just want you to think for a minute. What messages did you get about gay or lesbian people as a child? What kinds of things did you hear about them? How were they treated in your schools? What kinds of words were they called? Were they lifted up and praised for their accomplishments? Was it sort of derogatory to call someone gay or some other slang word for that? What did you hear in your families about them, in your schools, and from media and culture, TV shows, movies, songs? And then also think about growing up, what kinds of messages did you get about transgender people in those same spaces? Were they lifted up as being accomplished and powerful and worthy of love and honor, or were they derided or mocked or talked badly about? And just as we're going through all of this and thinking about serving LGBTQ survivors in our agencies, and a lot of this is also going to apply to how we support our LGBTQ coworkers and show solidarity as well. As we're thinking about serving survivors, just remember what it must, think what it must have been like to grow up hearing all of these messages and these words and these ways of talking about who you are as a child. Imagine what it was like growing up hearing words that you know describe you being used to insult people around you. And just remember that this, while people can be super confident and move through a lot of trauma, that a lot of times the experience of growing up and growing into young adulthood or coming out at any age as LGBTQ can be something that is also wrapped in some trauma and maybe some shame that's not at all deserved, but you know, we all internalize messages when we're going through rough times, even when those messages aren't based in reality. So have empathy. Remember that this requires some tenderness and thoughtfulness on your part. We're going to do a little bit of a quick review since I know not everybody was on the 101. Excuse me. So when we talk about LGBTQ, I've chosen for this webinar to mostly use LGBTQ+. Some people use other letters. So those mean lesbian, which we usually use to refer to a woman who's attracted to other women. Gay, which can be anyone of any gender, but frequently is used to refer to a man who's attracted to other men. Bisexual means someone who's attracted to people with the same gender identity as them and people who have a different gender identity. Transgender means that someone's gender identity that they were assigned at birth does not match their gender identity today, that they identify as a gender different from the one people assumed of them when they were little. The Q can stand for queer or questioning, and queer is a loaded word. It's one of those to where we mentioned earlier language is contested and evolving. That started as a slur. So a lot of times we find that some older LGBTQ people do not like that word, don't use it for themselves, don't necessarily love hearing it. And there are a lot of other people who that's their favorite word to describe their orientation, where it's been reclaimed in a way that they feel empowered by that word. So mirror the language of the person that you're talking to. And we also include questioning in the Q there. The cue for questioning is because a lot of times, because we've had so many messages growing up that this isn't who you are, or you're not allowed to be LGBTQ, or surely you can't be, or there's a cultural or family expectation that you're going to grow up and be in a heterosexual marriage and have children and have your life look a certain way, and you've had so much messaging that you can't be, that sometimes it's not like just flipping a switch and being like, yep, I'm going to come out now, we're here I am. A lot of times there's this period of just sort of inner wrangling and kind of questioning who you are. And it's super important during those times to give people support, to be support and encouragement to explore who they are, to let them know that whoever they are, that they deserve love and are worthy of care and respect. It's also important when someone is questioning not to relate their questioning to their trauma. I regularly hear from survivors, particularly survivors of complex trauma like child sexual abuse or child sexual exploitation or human trafficking, that when they first come out as being questioning their sexual orientation or identity, that frequently they've heard from mentors or providers, this is just a response to your trauma. And they've spoken about how minimizing and harmful that can be. So if someone's questioning their identity or orientation, typically it's best to give them space and be a good listener, and eventually they will land on their answer. And their answer may be that they land on being like, yeah, I questioned for a while and I'm pretty sure I'm not. And their answer might be, I questioned for a while and I know now who I am. But either way, having that space to question and still be supported is important. Intersex means that someone's genitalia do not fit neatly into the binary that we assign babies into, and sometimes people don't even know that they're intersex until they're adults. I know someone who grew up thinking she was a man, and it wasn't until in adulthood that she had to have some medical procedures at which they discovered a set of ovaries in her body that she did not expect. So in the past, sometimes you might have heard the word hermaphrodite. That is not a word that we use today, so avoid that word. The word you would want to use instead is intersex. Asexual, the A is for asexual, not ally. So asexual is also a spectrum. You'll find a lot of these things exist on a spectrum. Asexual means that someone is either not sexually attracted to other people at all, or not often, or not very much, or only under certain circumstances. It can include people who might call themselves demisexual, which means that they're only attracted to someone who they have an existing emotional connection with. So it's kind of a whole spectrum. The reason we don't include allies, a lot of people are kind of bummed when they find out the A is not for ally, because being an ally is important and is a great role to fill, and we need allies, and we love allies, and allies save lives. And at the same time, when we're talking about having an LGBTQ specific space for people to process and share their experiences, as much of an ally as anyone could be, it's still not the same as having that experience for yourself. And then the P frequently refers to pansexual, which is a word we use to refer to someone who's attracted to anyone of any gender identity, regardless of their body. A lot of times you may wonder, why do we have pansexual and bisexual? They sound a whole lot alike. I would agree with you. And also for some people, there's a very fine distinction between those two. So again, let the person use the language that they feel comfortable with, reflect their language when you're talking to them, and you should be fine. And then the plus is because there are all sorts of ways that we understand ourselves. And so that's just to let people know that if you don't see your letter in here, but you definitely identify as some variety of not cis and heterosexual, you're still included. So here we have the gender unicorn, and I'm going to pause, mute my phone for a moment and give you a second to look that over. So the gender unicorn, I know some of you may have seen the genderbread man, which was a model that used to be used and was popular for a while. I like the gender unicorn better. It was created by Trans Student Educational Resources, and part of what I love about the gender unicorn is that instead of presenting gender as a spectrum where we have, if we take identity, for example, And we have female, woman, girl on one end and male, man, boy on the other end. And the more you embody anything that is considered feminine, the less you're allowed to embody anything that's masculine. What's cool about the gender unicorn is you can choose on each of those spectrums. So how much do you identify as a female, woman, or girl? How much do you identify as a male, man, or boy? Or something altogether different. So being non-binary, if someone identifies as non-binary, doesn't mean that they're smack in the middle of man and woman. It can mean that they embody gender differently than just fitting into one or the other of the binaries. So your identity is who you are and who you know yourself to be, a deeply held sense of who you are. Gender expression is how you present to the world. And so we have feminine, masculine, and other. And that includes things like the way you dress, the way you carry yourself, the way you speak, whether or not you wear lots of makeup or jewelry. And so someone could be, it's separate from your identity. So someone could be a woman and still have a very masculine gender expression. Maybe you know someone like that. Someone could be a man and still have a very feminine gender expression. Someone could be a man with a very masculine gender expression. Someone could be non-binary and not identify as male or female and could have a very feminine gender expression. So non-binary doesn't mean your expression is perfectly in the middle and androgynous. Any more than being a woman means that you necessarily have to go around looking like, you know, a 1950s pinup all the time. There's all sorts of ways that people play with their gender expression. Sex assigned at birth is basically your genitalia, and that's where they look at a baby who's born and say, ha-ha, here's the genitals we have, and this is the sex we're assigning at birth. That may be different from your gender identity, and it may be different from your gender expression. So the bottom two are attraction. And frequently, people hear about sexual orientation and just assume that it's the same. And for a lot of people, it is the same as their romantic or emotional attraction or orientation. But some people experience that as different from each other. So I just want to throw that out there, that there may be some people who are physically attracted to people of any gender. They're sexually attracted to anyone of any gender, but maybe they find that they're typically emotionally attracted more often than not to women. Or maybe someone is sexually attracted to men, but tend to find themselves romantically attracted to people of any gender. So those don't always have to align. Frequently they do. And depending on the age of the person that you're working with, they may not even see those as separate things or understand them themselves. They just know that some people make them smile more than others and make them feel extra warm and fuzzy. But depending on how old someone is, how much access to information about their identities that they've had, they may define those as different from each other. There you go. It's important to remember intersectional oppression when working with LGBTQ survivors, because even though that survivor has an identity somewhere on the LGBTQ spectrum, doesn't mean that they don't also experience other forms of oppression, including racism or ableism if they have a health condition or a disability. Sexism, they can experience sexism and homophobia at the same time. Classism, if they grew up or currently live in poverty, they can experience all forms of intersectional oppression. So it's important for us to remember when we're working with that survivor, they don't experience homophobia. No, I did not draw that. You want to know who drew that, Rachel? I see Rachel's question. That's actually an image from one of JP's old slides. So you can compliment JP on the spectacular art skills the next time you see JP. That's hysterical. I'm grinning now. Thank you. So it's important to remember when working with a survivor that they're not able to separate out their experience of being LGBTQ from their experience of being Black or Latinx or a woman. These all are blended for them. And so this is why there's a lot we can unpack in that, and we don't have time in this webinar too, but just remember, when you show up at a table as an advocate, let's say with my identities, showing up at a table as a survivor
and an LGBTQ individual who grew up in poverty, and I bring all of those identities with me to the conversation that we're having. So it's important to be attentive to all of those. This is also why we say at NCCASA that we focus on marginalized communities, focus our efforts on the margins to make sure everybody gets served, because we know that survivors can't unpack their survivor status from all these other things they've experienced over their life. You want to remember, when we're thinking about how all of this impacts serving survivors, sexual violence is not about sex. It is about power and control, about having power or trying to establish or assert power and control over someone else. And because it's about power and control, it's committed more often than not against people who lack power. And that can include children and youth, which we know children and youth are especially vulnerable to harm. People in society who have marginalized identities, people whose society has marginalized. And that's one of the distinctions I make a lot, is that marginalized populations aren't just magically marginalized. They're at the margins because somehow our culture and society have pushed them to the edges, right? Tried to push them to where they have less access. And that also means that young people who have marginalized identities are especially vulnerable to sexual violence. And LGBTQ people are frequently not in positions of power in their communities or cultures, especially in areas of the state or country or world where they have to be secretive about their identities or are berated or experience violence because of their identities. We talk a lot in our work about trauma. And I think most of us know what trauma is, which is where you experience some sort of experiences where your capacity to cope is exceeded by the pain or overwhelm of the experience. So you're experiencing something that you don't have the tools or capacity in that moment to get out of, to escape, to fix, to control, to manage. And it causes this overwhelm in your body. And a long period of trauma, experiencing trauma, repeated traumas or trauma over an extended period of time causes your body and your nervous system to start to adapt these coping mechanisms to deal with that trauma you're experiencing, which are then sometimes cause problems with your health or with your well-being overall. The reason I bring trauma up now is to remind you that living under a form of oppression, whether it's racial or because of any other identity that you hold, to include being LGBTQ, can be a traumatic experience and often is trauma. So even if we assume there is a child who never experienced any other form of oppression other than homophobia or transphobia, but from the time they were little were made to feel like who they were is wrong, were berated for it, were dismissed, were minimized, were invalidated, over a period of time, that can create these trauma responses in the body. So remember, when you're working with LGBTQ survivors, that in addition to the trauma that they are experiencing and needing healing from related to their survivorship of sexual violence or sexual abuse, they're probably also carrying some trauma from having experienced homophobia or transphobia at different points in their life, and that's a trauma that needs to be acknowledged if it's there, if they are, if that's something that they identify as a challenge for them and want to unpack. That if you're approaching them holistically as a complete person, you're going to allow space for them to unpack some of how that felt and how that impacted them as well. Because when people come into your agencies, they aren't coming just as survivors. If you look at this, this is a slide about a lifetime exposure to trauma. And if we start at the left of that blue line in the middle, the left is where they're born, the right is where they walk in the door of your agency. Especially when we're looking at marginalized communities, you may see that they have over time, because of being marginalized by society, experienced a variety of different traumatic events, whether it was substance use in the home, DV in the home, poverty, a substance use disorder, and one of those bars may certainly be experiencing homophobia or transphobia. And when they come into your door at the end of that line there, they're walking in as a whole person with all of this trauma, and if all you say to them is, I'm going to help you with your sexual violence problem, or I'm going to help you with that child sexual abuse, and we fail to address some of these other pieces that have impacted their experience of learning who they are and understanding themselves, then we've missed the opportunity to build trust with them by giving space for them to be a whole person and bring up these other pieces of their identity that are meaningful to them. So we're going to do a few depressing slides. So this is where I give you the content warning that the next few slides are a little bit heavy. But we're going to get through them. Let me check my time. Yes, okay, we're good on time. The next few slides are a little bit heavy, but they're really important for us to understand, the ways that being LGBTQ can impact someone's mental health. And in some data that we have, in states that have no hate crime or unemployment laws protecting LGBTQ people, they are 5 times more likely to have 2 or more disorders in the anxiety, depression, and PTSD family of disorders. In states that have hostile political campaigns against LGBTQ people, whether it's bathroom campaigns, something against gay marriage, or against same-sex marriage, in states that have hostile political campaigns, mood disorders among LGBTQ people increase by 1/3. People of color and undocumented LGBTQ survivors are more likely to experience physically violent forms of hate attacks. Of LGBTQ survivors who reported to police, 80% reported police response being indifferent or hostile. And of LGBTQ survivors who reported negative police behavior, 3% report experiencing sexual violence by law enforcement. And this is to say we know that 3% is still not the norm, but 3% is still too high. And it leads to fear, to where people are then fearful to come and report. Even if they wanted to report, they're fearful to do so. So we need to be thinking about ways that LGBTQ people are impacted both by increased oppression that causes increased mental health risk, and to decrease in feeling safe accessing the systems that we say are in place to help protect them. So a couple of years ago, NC Coalition Against Domestic Violence and Equality NC did a health impact assessment of House Bill 2 and House Bill 142 on LGBTQ North Carolinians. And HB 2 was the bill that required people to use bathrooms that were associated with their assigned gender at birth. HB 142 was a bill that replaced it, that gave local control and allowed local control to pass laws that kept them from going into the bathrooms that assigned to their gender identity. So when HB 2 happened, those of you who have trans and gender nonconforming friends probably heard them talk a whole lot more about their fears. At least hopefully, if you're close to them and they trust you, you would have heard them talk a lot more about fears, about experiencing violence, about people just randomly harassing them when they were on the streets, because having this campaign created this belief in our culture that it's okay to mistreat people who are trans or gender nonconforming. Because of that, an estimated 31% of trans and gender nonconforming North Carolinians experienced discrimination after HB 2, 14% delayed gender transition, 10% considered suicide after HB 2 because of it and because of its impacts, and 5% experienced increased violence. I bring this up not because, we're not having a campaign or training in this moment on HB 2, but I want you to make the connection in your mind and in the way you see people between cultural and societal climate and laws, and how this impacts people's health and wellness. That does contribute to spikes in health and wellness issues, that then when you have that LGBTQ survivor walk through your door, these are all things they're carrying with them when they're trying to unpack other forms of harm they've experienced. Youth are especially vulnerable. I'm going to put these up here and let you check them out. Check out some of these statistics. 30% of LGBTQ youth report family physical violence after disclosing. There is an epidemic of homeless LGBTQ youth, which then makes them more likely to end up engaging in survival sex or experience other forms of trafficking. Foster youth who are LGBTQ are 2 times more likely to have a group placement than a family. Trans foster youth have twice as many placements on average than their cisgender peers. They're more likely to experience poor treatment in foster care. This one's really hard for me. LGBTQ youth are 7.4 times more likely to experience sexual violence than their peers. And as we mentioned earlier, they are more likely to engage in survival sex, but they're also more likely when they do to be held for prostitution charges instead of being seen as victims of a crime that was done against them. If you're wondering about that wide range, that 2 to 10%, they are 2 times, LGBTQ girls are 2 times more likely to be held for prostitution charges. GBTQ boys are 2 to 10 times, or are 10 times more likely to be held for prostitution charges. So I believe that's where we see more of a pathologization and criminalization of gay male sexuality. So if you are a boy, even as a minor engaging in a sex trade, which we know is the definition of human trafficking, you're more likely to be seen as a criminal and held for charges. So we have a couple of studies here that I got off of Child Trend's website. And in the Journal of Adolescent Health, for each additional context in which a transgender youth's chosen name is used, their risk of suicidal behavior is reduced by more than half. So some of you may be familiar with some of the really high percentages around transgender people who have considered suicide. And I've seen that statistic twisted sometimes as if it's somehow trying to prove that being transgender is a mental illness. But we have studies here that show when kids' chosen name are used, their risk of suicidal behavior is decreased by more than half. When they fully socially transition and have been supported by their families in doing so, they actually have symptoms of depression that are comparable to their non-transgender, their cisgender peers. So a lot of times, and also that study, I don't think I put that on the slide, but that study shows that they have similar rates of depression and only slightly higher rates of anxiety. So what this says to me, this is where we get to some of the good news, is that every space that transgender youth, and I would say this probably extends to lesbian, gay, and bisexual cisgender youth as well, for every space that these children receive validation and are not told that they are wrong or broken for who they are, we reduce their mental health risk significantly. One of the things that I want to bring up around serving anybody with any marginalized identity or any survivor, this framework is actually useful. I don't know if you're familiar with the 5 domains of well-being, but I really like that work coming out of the Full Frame Initiative. And the concept is that we have these 5 areas in our life that when we have them contribute to our overall well-being. We have social connectedness, stability, which is the ability to predict from one moment or one day to the next what your life is going to look like. Safety from physical and emotional harm. Mastery, which means the opportunity to succeed at things and to show that your actions can actually create a change on the outcomes in your environment. And then meaningful access to relevant resources, which would include things as material as economic stability. Could also include things like having access to a hotline that is culturally specific or meets your needs or is inclusive. There's a whole lot of work that the Full Frame Initiative has done to flesh out this concept, and you can download their toolkit. It's especially relevant for safety planning. But what I really love about it is this concept that they offer of trade-offs, which is that frequently our culture or our society is set up such that people have to trade off access to one of these in some degree. They have to reduce their access or sacrifice their access to one or more of these in order to have access to others. which then means they're forced to prioritize which ones mean the most to them. And they make these trade-offs. And so our role in safety planning, our role in service provision, our role in prevention is to try to reduce the number of trade-offs that people are having to make to access things that contribute to their well-being. One of the ways in which this is especially relevant for LGBTQ survivors, especially youth, is when we think about how people who are not validated, who experience homophobia or transphobia, they don't have a space where they're feeling affirmed, where they're feeling safe, will sometimes prioritize having that gender or orientation validated over some of these other things because that's part of their sense of safety and stability and mastery. An example of that would be numerous times in this state we get calls about trans youth who end up either in a home or in a shelter after experiencing trafficking. And in the shelter or home that they're placed in or their home of origin, they're continually misgendered or treated poorly. And even after being quote unquote rescued from their trafficking situation, they end up running away and they go back to their trafficker because at least in that context, I'm having my gender identity validated and they're using the right pronouns and they're calling me the name that I tell them. And we need to be thinking about the fact that when we offer services and resources that are not LGBTQ inclusive, they're less meaningful and they're less relevant. So people will end up trading that off. They then have to choose between having their gender or orientation affirmed or having access to some of the other supports and safeties that we hope to offer them. So when we talk about trauma-informed care, these are the principles of trauma-informed care: safety, trustworthiness and transparency, peer support, collaboration, mutuality, empowerment, voice and choice, cultural, historical, and gender sensitivity. Some areas that you may see LGBTQ sensitivity come into this are on trustworthiness and transparency. One thing I would say is do not pretend to have it all together with regard to LGBTQ survivors if you don't, because a survivor would much rather hear someone say, we are really striving to be good allies in our agency, and we're getting the training that we need, but sometimes we're going to get it wrong, and if we ever do get it wrong with you, we want you to feel like you can let us know. That's an example of transparency, kind of building that rapport and safety. Trustworthiness would also include things like not outing someone. If you're working with a survivor who their name does not match what's on their medical records, then being really careful if you're dealing with medical systems to not out them without their consent. It can also include things like if a child tells you a name, using the name that they tell you, showing that you're being trustworthy, you're trying to honor their identity. That also plays into empowerment, voice, and choice, giving them choice about what they want to be called in your program, what name you use, empowering them to make decisions about their own gender expression, offering peer support to the extent that you're able. I know some rape crisis centers have started doing LGBTQ support groups that are by and for people who identify as LGBTQ so they can have access to peers to share ideas with. These are all really important. I think safety is the one that is probably the biggest, is just kind of unpacking what does safety mean. So when we think about safety, we're thinking about safety in our community or neighborhood, and community could include your school or your church or any group that you're a part of, any community that you're part of on a regular basis. Safety in relationship, which could include parents or siblings or romantic partners or the service provider. They're having a relationship with you. It's a professional relationship, but you are in relationship with this person. And then what does it mean to have safety in the body? And that's where earlier when we talked about the neuroscience of trauma, talked a little bit about how that lands in the body and impacts the nervous system. A lot of times that trauma response that builds up over a period of being invalidated is associated in that person's mind and body with the experience of being misgendered or invalidated or having their identity or orientation dismissed. So what that means is if they're in relationship with you and in your agency, and you're constantly getting it wrong and misgendering them or using the wrong name or assuming that they have a husband when they don't, they have a wife, or making gendered assumptions around who they are, then that's going to be kicking up that nervous system arousal, which means that they are not going to be able to relax into receiving the kinds of support and service that you may want to provide. So remember, when it comes to trying to get it right, this isn't just an intellectual exercise where we're trying to be politically correct. This is an exercise in showing someone that their overall embodied sense of safety is important to you as a provider, as an advocate. This might be different for LGBTQ survivors because maybe they've had to be secretive with their relationships in the past. Maybe they're not out in their community or neighborhood. So think through the ways that these areas in which we have safety may be defined a little differently, and that ultimately when you're looking at safety planning with the survivor, before you can help them safety plan, you have to understand what does safety mean to you. And that might mean asking a few more questions, especially if they hold other marginalized identities in addition to being LGBTQ. Ask a few more questions and take time to let them self-describe, give them space to tell you what safety means to them and what their hopes are in this process. Sometimes LGBTQ inclusive programming might not still feel safe. So just because you put a rainbow flag on your door or your website and you give everyone a pronouns training and everybody attended the 101 and the 102 that we're offering here, and you're trying to stay connected in your community, doesn't mean that you're always going to get it right. And sometimes LGBTQ inclusive programming might potentially still feel less safe than programming that maybe is being peer-led or peer support or, you know, theory versus practice. Like, we can have policies in place all the time about being inclusive or equitable, but we still have to put those policies into practice. So what do you do? Let's say you run a shelter. What do you do when all of your staff are trained on LGBTQ sensitivity and are doing great, but you have another shelter resident who is bullying them with homophobic or transphobic slurs? What do you do if they're in support group? How do you train your support group facilitators if you have a support group that someone says something that is transphobic and suddenly another a trans member of the support group is feeling really invalidated and also really frightened to speak up in the group because they're not sure if they're going to be heard or if there's space for them. So just be aware that having inclusive ideals is not the same as getting into the nuts and bolts of how do we handle this situation? How do we handle this other situation? And if your strategy is that you're, as long as it's not your staff person who made the error or said the slur, that it's fine, you're still inclusive, then you're missing some of the ways in which people experience your agency in practice, not just in theory. And I see some things in the chat box. Let me open that up. Ooh, hi, Carrie. Yeah. So we had someone who brought up a really good point. What this says is the idea that survivors often make trade-offs by coming in our doors. They may have chosen to seek services knowing that the services we provide may not affirm them, especially from trans or questioning callers who call our helplines to say they weren't sure how they would be received on our line. And I would like for us to acknowledge the extra work LGBTQ callers have put in to reach out to us. And I am super sorry that went to all panelists, so it's actually in the chat box for everybody right now, so we can't really anonymize it. But I do want to acknowledge that that is something that is absolutely true. It is very scary to walk through the doors or call the hotline when you've been failed by a lot of systems in the past. So whatever system you're in, whether it's a rape crisis center, or whether it's a rape crisis center, whether it's a child advocacy center, whether it is I know we have people on here from juvenile justice. We may have people from other forms of law enforcement. We may have people who are DAs or somehow involved in the court system. Whatever system you're in, there are people who have experienced harm at the hands of your system and have been minimized by your system. None of us are perfect. All of our systems have flaws, and we're all made up of humans who make mistakes and who have different levels of being educated or informed about the issue. So whatever system you're in, recognize that they have probably experienced or heard of other people in your system who did not receive them as a whole person or know how to handle their needs or know the right language or know how to listen properly. And so it's very scary for people who've been harmed or oppressed by other systems to reach out and connect with you in your system. So there's a lot of trust building that needs to happen first, and sometimes even acknowledging that that was a big step, that we know that that had to be intimidating to reach out, can be part of that trustworthiness and transparency we talked about in trauma-informed care earlier. So thinking through the ways that you are sometimes building trust, not just between you and that client, but sometimes you're in a position of needing to do a little bit of repair with that client around systems that may have failed them in the past, and they're just fear that you may fail them too. That's where just being really honest about where you are and being very sincere when you have made a misstep with someone, to acknowledge it and own it and be accountable for it and say, oh, sorry about that, thank you. Okay. So making sure that we have, that we own it and are accountable when we do cause harm or get things wrong with people is a big step. Let's see. There's another study that explored the experiences and perspectives of victim service providers regarding their knowledge, attitudes, and skills in working with LGBTQ victims of crime. It was a 7-site study across the U.S. The findings are that there are concerns around working with minors and outing. So a lot of times, in order for minors to get the services that they need in a way that is sensitive and feels safe, they end up disclosing their identity to someone. They may have fears around being outed to other service providers or to their families and what that might look like. There are assumptions around bisexuality and pansexuality and gender identity. So assuming that just because someone is in a heterosexual relationship at the time that they are straight. So not recognizing that someone who is bisexual is still bisexual, even if they're in a relationship with someone or of the opposite gender or of a different gender from them. Someone can still be bisexual even if they're in a relationship with someone of the same gender as them. They don't cease to be bisexual and become gay the moment they have a relationship with someone of the same gender. So remembering not to make assumptions around people's orientation or around their gender identity. Again, someone's expression may not align with their identity or their sex assigned at birth. And so not making assumptions about who they are, giving them space to define themselves to you. A lot of service providers showed what they called cultural blindness, which is where you fail to ask important identity-based questions and often made assumptions in lieu of asking, which brings us to intake forms. When you're doing intake forms, a lot of times the questions that you have on your intake forms is a way to signal that you're open to hearing someone's experiences and identity and orientation. So if you have things on your intake form like, pronouns, giving them a space to identify the pronouns they use. If you have to, because of your system, use their legal name, giving them a space to put the name that they go by. Giving them opportunities to help clarify who they are. Doing things like when you ask if they have a partner, not making gendered assumptions about who that partner is on your intake form. If someone experiences a rape or sexual assault and they tell you it was someone they were dating, not making assumptions about, when your boyfriend, being open to the idea that people can have different experiences. Micro invalidations in the form of providers not understanding how LGBT clients perceive the victim assistance system. And this maybe gets back to some of what we were talking about a moment ago that one of you brought up around recognizing that someone has taken a big step by reaching out to your agency or walking through your doors, or in cases, I know with child advocacy, since we have some child advocate people on the line, when people come through your doors, sometimes they're not even coming willingly. They're just kind of swept up into a system that they're confused by and overwhelmed by, and it can be especially scary for them if they aren't sure if they're going to be supported or validated in your agency and with your work. So remembering that that they are taking a big step and that these systems can be perceived as scary or hostile, and maybe going a little more slowly, giving them more space to self-define, giving them a little more gentleness and spaciousness around the ways that they talk about their identities and experiences. Some specific barriers to service be for, what would some specific barriers to service be for minor LGBTQ survivors? And this is where I want to invite y'all to hit the chat box, or maybe if you want me to unmute you and let you talk. Why is my computer jumping around? If anyone has any thoughts around specific barriers to service for minor survivors, what do you think? So their age, so a lot of times we have to get parental consent for things. Lack of available programs, we have in there, that's very true. Their age, that thing with parental consent, a lot of times you end up in a situation where you have a family that completely does not support a child's identity or orientation, and a child who perceives that and experiences that as being hostile and frightening and emotionally abusive, and then you're in this situation of having to interact with parents and with kids and walk that space, that really uncomfortable space of feeling like you're in between them. They may need parental consent, which is tricky for folks who are not in touch with their parents or have a context of family violence. Correct. So some of them may not be living with their families anymore. A lot of them may have either been kicked out or may have run away or moved out early because of having homophobia or transphobia in the home. One of the things that I see a lot, especially since I've done some work around trafficking, is that we frequently will see LGBTQ youth who are already systems involved, whether it's juvenile justice or foster care systems. And our standard go-to line is, well, make a report, call CPS. This is what we do when there is a child who's experiencing harm or experienced abuse. And a lot of times CPS comes out and investigates, and because they don't understand, that particular case manager may not understand the emotionally abusive impact of constant invalidation in the home on a kid. They're like, oh, we don't see any abuse here, and move on. And then we have these kids who keep running away because they're experiencing emotional abuse at home, but it's not being seen as such by the systems. And instead, these kids who continue running away get seen as sort of bad kids or troubled kids instead of people digging a little deeper to find out what they're running from. With trafficking survivors, we have some of the same concerns, but then we add in, especially if it's sex trafficking, we add in the fact that a lot of times they're doing what they need to do to survive when they've been kicked out of homes or run away from abusive homes. They're trying to figure out how to survive. They may be really confused because they may be in a situation where their trafficking or sexual exploitation experience is validating their gender identity or their sexual orientation while causing them traumatic harm because of the coercion, and that can be really confusing. I know those of us who work with survivors have talked about helping survivors unpack the fact that something could be sexual violence and still cause physical arousal. And this is a similar thing to where it may be that something was sexual violence, but in some ways validated their experience. Not all survivors have that experience, but some may, and they may find that especially confusing. And frequently in the trafficking movement, we hear people say that it's really harmful because sometimes you have heterosexual trafficking survivors who are forced to have sex with someone of the same gender as them as part of their trafficking experience. But I've also spoken to survivors who are LGBTQ who were forced to have sexual encounters with people of a different gender from them as part of their trafficking experience, and then found that very confusing and frightening as they tried to understand who they were. Someone mentioned non-inclusive services for survivors and victims can be a barrier. Absolutely. All of these are things that can be barriers that you can work on trying to be at least aware of in your work. Some other barriers include dealing with stigma, negative experiences or the perception thereof, and that's where we talked about people may have negative experiences with your system. They may have heard of other people who've had negative experiences with your system or your agency or your kind of agency that makes them scared to come in. You can have hetero or cis-sexist agency policies and procedures. You can have a system that prioritizes differently gendered relationships and cisgender experiences and categorizes these as natural. You know, if you're saying you're being inclusive, but you're still seeing it as a lesser option, then you're not being fully inclusive. Here's where we have what Jessica brought up, which is lack of LGBTQ specific programs and services, systemic failure. A lot of times we meet especially young people and adults who the system has failed over and over again. We have a distrust of systems and research because a lot of times these systems weren't set up to protect them in the first place, especially when they hold multiple marginalized identities. And they may have some shame around, and I use the word non-normative here in the sociological sense. That doesn't mean that it's not natural. We just mean it doesn't fit a cultural norm. That's what we mean when we say that in sociology context. So they may have shame around having experiences, identities, and behaviors that don't fit their family or cultural norm. And that we all know, those of us who've worked with survivors of sexual violence know that that shame makes it really hard and scary to talk to people. It makes it really hard and scary to reach out for support when you need it. So when you add that these people have experienced sexual violence in some form, and they have shame about that, and also may have shame around having experiences, identities, and behaviors that don't match their cultures or families' norms, it's really, really hard for people to reach out. So a good conversation to be having is how can we, A, do our work so that if and when people reach out, we're able to support them adequately, but B, let them know that we're open to receiving that and holding space for that. And it's important to remember that unique people have unique traumas and unique triggers. So again, we mentioned earlier, LGBTQ people are not monoliths. We don't all have the same needs, the same expectations, the same triggers, and what is exceedingly triggering for one person in terms of an actual trauma trigger may not be at all for someone else. And what is perfectly fine for one survivor might be very frightening and triggering and overwhelming for another. So just being aware that we do the best we can to be as inclusive and thoughtful and trauma-informed, and also there's always room to learn and grow because everybody responds to trauma differently. In thinking about culturally appropriate service provision, you're going to try to not make assumptions about people's identities. When you ask questions, we don't want to interrogate, but make sure the questions, unless your job is to interrogate, which for many of us it's not, you're going to want to ask open-ended questions that open the door to communication, so leave it open for them to fill in gaps instead of either or leading questions. Don't ask irrelevant questions about people's bodies or identities. So I know we're telling you that asking is signaling, but when we ask, we're talking about things like what name do you want to be called? What are your pronouns? And if someone uses a word and you're not entirely sure what they mean with it, saying, what does that mean to you, to make sure that you understand so you don't get it wrong. Don't ask questions about their bodies. That's seen as intrusive. Unless someone's genitalia has some sort of bearing on the work you're about to do with them and the collaboration, whether it's a rape kit or something like that, you don't need to be asking questions about their bodies. Don't ask things like, have you had the surgery, which is kind of strange because there's not a surgery. There are a variety of different methods of medical transition that someone may or may not either choose or have access to. So don't ask questions like that. That tends to feel like prying, like they're answering the question to satisfy your personal curiosity rather than to, avoiding those questions to allow a chance to build safety and trust. You're going to mirror the language people use to refer to themselves. If you make a mistake, which, by the way, we all do, just apologize and correct yourself. No need to make a big, huge deal out of it. Just, oh, I'm sorry. If someone says, actually, my pronoun is they, you can say, oh, I'm sorry, and then repeat your sentence using the correct pronoun or name. If you want some extra training on that, Forge is a national anti-violence nonprofit that focuses on the needs of transgender survivors. They have a pronoun series. If you go to Forge's website and search pronouns, you'll see a series of tutorials that include tutorials on how to use they, them pronouns. It has tutorials on how to respond if you misgender someone or get corrected. It includes information on how to respond to someone else if they misgender someone. Because if all you're doing is using the right name and pronouns and language when you're in front of the client, but then you turn around and talk to other staff and other team members, misgendering them, you aren't being as supportive as you could. So even if the client's not there, if you hear someone else on the team misgender, then you can say, oh, I think their pronouns are, and move on from there. Use privacy, take great pains to not out someone. That can include talking to someone in the hall, talking to another staff member in the hall where people can overhear. That can include talking about someone's orientation or identity to someone who's not part of their service team, who doesn't need that information. And then create safe spaces. So LGBTQ specific support groups, for example. Having safe spaces is really important and can build trust if you're able. And find out where those LGBTQ specific resources in your community are. Does your community have a P flag, Parents and Friends of Lesbians and Gays, to refer family members to? Does it have an LGBTQ center? Is there a youth group that is supportive of LGBTQ students? Do the local schools have a GSA or Gender and Sexuality Alliance to help students have access to safe people? Find out where the safe spaces are in your community. You're going to want to use a person-centered approach, which means first, do personal and organizational work and decide if you can do this appropriately. I'm going to be honest and say that if nobody in your agency or only a few in your agency are really committed to being LGBTQ inclusive and you go put that rainbow sticker on your door and that person walks in and is met with harm or hostility or is invalidated with microaggressions, even when you're trying to get it right, you're just not aware or thinking about it, what's going to happen is they're going to lose trust. It's like you almost feel more betrayed because this agency put that sticker out there and talked about being LGBTQ inclusive to try to show you that this was a safe place, and it turned out to feel like a lie or a betrayal. So make sure you're doing your work to decide if you can do this appropriately. Work with culturally specific organizations. We're going to talk a little bit later about partnering with other agencies in your community who can support you. Ensure that all of your staff are trained on LGBTQ sensitivity, and this is important both for working with survivors and in terms of having an LGBTQ-friendly workplace, which brings me to a side note, which is what would it look like to hire accordingly? Who's on your staff? Do you have LGBTQ people who are helping develop and design and plan and implement your programming? The more you work on creating an inclusive environment, the more that's going to include bringing in staff who can support that vision more thoughtfully. You want to adapt and overhaul your agency and personal policies and practices to be affirming. So look at things like intake, protocols, where people are housed, is it gender segregated? If the only groups you have are gender segregated, or the only groups you have are for women, a lot of times LGBTQ people are more comfortable in groups for other LGBTQ people of any gender than they are in a group that is associated with their gender. So having policies and practices that are affirming and create safe spaces. And then invest in prevention. We know the CDC research on sexual violence prevention has identified a handful of risk and protective factors. One of those risk factors, actually two of them that are relevant. One is rigid adherence to harmful gender norms, which frequently heavily impacts LGBTQ youth. And another one is association with, or hypermasculine beliefs or association with hypermasculine peers. So again, we know that that masculinity, just like femininity, is neither good nor bad, but that there are ways of expressing masculinity that we know to be more toxic or harmful. And that's a risk factor for sexual violence, according to the research. So one of the ways we can do prevention is to advocate for the rights and well-being of LGBTQ people, especially youth. Be aware and attentive to what policies and laws and practices and agencies are doing in your community so that you can stay involved in that dialogue and support them in having access to safe spaces. And again, think at your organization, who is in leadership. A lot of times people will hire, but they hire at certain rungs of the agency level. So who's in leadership at your agency? Who is your target population that you want to be inclusive and equitable to? And do they see themselves reflected in the providers in your agency? And this is true around racial and ethnic representation, culturally responsive and culturally specific services, gender and sexual minority representation, racial equity training, gender and LGBTQ training. Do you have survivor input and leadership in your agency? I bring up trafficking adjacent. I use this slide a lot in my trafficking presentations, and I didn't modify it for this one, but people with adjacent lived experience can be really useful. So a lot of times people who are LGBTQ may have experience, they have higher rates of experiences of things like economic instability, higher rates of homelessness, higher rates of having to engage in survival sex. And so remembering to bring people with lived experience that may not be the kinds of things that people tend to put on their resumes. I'm trying to think of the right way to word that. Basically, don't be scared of hiring people who maybe bring perspectives that don't fit your cultural norms in your community into your agency, because they're going to be able to bring you insights that other people who don't have those identities cannot provide in the same way. You're going to want to collaborate with LGBTQ affirming partners. And so in your community, that might include LGBTQ centers and advocacy organizations. I know we have Equality NC is statewide. We have the Campaign for Southern Equality. We have in Charlotte area, Time Out Youth. We have in the Triangle area, Inside Out works with youth. We have Transmission in the mountains. We have Outright Youth. There's all sorts of agencies that focus on LGBTQ communities, so find out who those are in your area and reach out. Send them an email, introduce yourself. Find out if you can collaborate. Do you want to co-sponsor a support group? Do you want to co-sponsor an outreach event? I have Rape Crisis. Yes, Western North Carolina. Let me look that up in just a moment. Rape Crisis and Domestic Violence Centers and Coalitions are going to be really important. I know many of you are with Rape Crisis or DV centers, but because this presentation has also got some CAC people, reach out and collaborate with them. Do they have an LGBTQ support group? Do they have resources or materials that you can refer people to? And then also harm reduction agencies tend to do a whole lot of work with LGBTQ individuals. A lot of times they do work with trans people on syringe exchanges, because we know syringe exchanges came out of substance use treatment movements and substance use response movements, and also a lot of trans people use syringes for
injections of hormones as part of their medical transition if they choose to do that, and so they may be connected with local harm reduction agencies to get support around that. I know in the Triangle, North Carolina Harm Reduction Coalition even offers a regular trans support group. Western North Carolina, there is, I think it's called Blue Ridge, what's it called? Blue Ridge something or other. There isn't, if you look, LGBTQ centers in North Carolina, there is one in the mountains. There's also a youth serving agency in the mountains, and then Transmission is in the mountains. Transmission is trans-specific. One of the cool things about Transmission is that they have a very loose, little bit of funding, but not much funding for rapid rehousing, but a loose network of host homes who have offered to take in homeless trans people on a temporary basis. So that's one thing that they can do. There's also a host home program, a more organized, nonprofit, more structured host home programs in Charlotte through Time Out Youth, and in Durham through the LGBTQ Center of Durham. They both have host home programs that work with young adults, so people in that aging out range, that 18 to 24, they can get them with a trained host home. So there's a lot of agencies. You may just need to Google to find the closest one to you. Now sometimes, as affirming as you are, you're going to be collaborating with partners who are not affirming. So here are some tips when you're in collaborations with people who don't get it. I'm going to encourage you to be a compassionate pain in the neck. And what some of the ways you can do that are to model proper language even when your client isn't present, even if the other community partner doesn't. So let's say you're working with a bisexual minor trafficking survivor, and she's left the room, and you have someone else who's cracking a joke about, you know, using homophobic slurs or whatever, or calling her a name that doesn't fit, then you can model it back and say, well, I think what she said was, or, you know, call them out on it, be like, I'm not going to use that word. That's not okay with me. Or if you see someone using the wrong pronouns for a trans survivor when that client's not present, you can say, oh, I believe their pronouns are they, them. Or if you hear someone say something that in some way maybe indirectly suggests that client is responsible for whatever harm they experienced because, you know, the way they dress like that, they have to dress that way, then you can counter that and say, we don't victim blame. You know, I don't ever want to victim blame. I don't think anyone should ever be assaulted or harmed just because of the way that they express their identity. So you can model that proper language, and that also gets a little bit into bystander intervention, which is in that couple down on this. What do you do when you hear an important partner make a homophobic or transphobic comment, misgender someone, or use a slur? And this is an area where I want to both empower you to be courageous and bold on behalf of the people you're working with, and I also want to remind you that you can do so compassionately, so you don't have to go all in on the person who said the wrong thing, but you can definitely make it clear that you don't agree, because one of the things that keeps people saying slurs and inappropriate comments around other partners is the belief that everyone agrees with them, or the assumption. You can recommend professional development and training opportunities they might not know about with regard to LGBTQ issues and frameworks. I know we all have our email list of the partners we work with regularly. And if you hear of a really good LGBTQ training or a workshop on LGBTQ youth, you can just send that out to your list, so you're sending it to the partners who have been problematic as well as people who have been affirming, so you're not calling anyone out. You're just like, hey, look, everybody, here's a workshop I'm going to, or a training I'm going to go to. And then remember your role and identities and cultural sensitivity, meaning if you are a white cis person who is hearing a transphobic comment from an African-American cis gay man, you might want to be aware of how your identities intersect with theirs. And sometimes what we can do is find culturally specific resources that you can send them that are not someone with more power than them in other areas of their lives belittling or explaining the issue to them. You can find culturally specific resources, like In Our Own Voices is a really good resource for LGBT people of color, or There's an agency called Familia, Queer and Trans Liberation, that is a Latinx-specific LGBTQ advocacy organization. So find something that's culturally specific to them so that you aren't trying to explain it and inadvertently imposing your cultural assumptions and ways of framing things over theirs. So before we wind down, we have 8 minutes left. Does anyone have any questions? Let me give it just a moment. You can still type questions in as we do these last couple of slides. I want to remind you again, here are some other people you can go to for some different perspectives. These are some of my favorites. And if you have any questions, you can always email me. I love getting email from people who've been at trainings, from our member agencies. I appreciate getting your feedback, getting your input. And I hope that, again, this wasn't a comprehensive, in-depth dive, but hopefully this gave you a few little threads that you can start following to see where they lead you in your agencies and serving survivors more inclusively. And I want to thank you all for joining us today. Hope y'all have a good day and stay safe in the middle of all of this, gesturing broadly, global pandemic, all that stuff. So stay safe and take care of yourselves. And I will try to get the PowerPoint to everybody. Okay. Y'all have a good day. Bye.